Welcome to Chapter 10. This chapter is on non-experimental research, finding relationships among variables. So, what we're going to be focusing on in this chapter is the type of research that just looks to explain if there's anything going on between two things. So, if we have two variables, and we remember a variable is anything that can vary among people or animals. So if we have two variables and we just want to know what happens when those two variables are in the same time and space, we can do a study that looks at that relationship. And when we do that type of study, it is called non-experimental research because we're not able to determine cause and effect in the same way that we are with experimental research. So the experimenter will look at the effect of a treatment on a behavior. So the experimenter or the researcher will see how an IV, an independent variable, has an effect on a DV, a dependent variable. In true experiments, they give us control over the variables because we're able to consider all extraneous variables that could become confounding variables and control for them so that they don't end up influencing our study, and we're able to see the true effects of an IV on a DV. Whereas in non-experimental research, we're not controlling for all of the variables, and therefore we're not able to be sure that there's not some outside factor affecting our DV that we're unaware of. And because of that, we're not able to determine cause and effect. So in non-experimental research, to summarize, there is no manipulation of an independent variable. We don't have control over all of the variables, and because of that, we are not able to make causal inferences. So the first type of non-experimental research that we're going to discuss are quasi-experiments. And quasi-experiments look a lot like true experiments. They have several of the same qualities and characteristics and processes. However, they don't quite make the cut. We do statistically analyze them in the exact same way that we analyze true experiments for the most part. However, the way that they are designed and set up make them so that they don't quite match all of the criteria that are needed in order for us to consider them absolutely pure, true experiments. So, you might be asking yourself, what are situations where you would have to use a quasi-experiment when clearly it would be um, preferable to use experimental research in most cases? So the situations in which we would have to use a quasi-experiment basically boil down to when our hypothesis would make it so that it's not necessarily practical or ethical to measure the independent variable using a true experiment. And so, certain types of hypotheses, certain groups that you might want to compare, are going to create certain limitations for you as a researcher. And because of those limitations, you might have to then do a quasi experiment. So, what are these limitations that would prevent you from doing a true experiment and make it so that you have to do a quasi experiment? Well, the first limitation is that of the independent variable. So, if the independent variable is manipulated by the researcher, then we would say that it's probably going to be a true experiment, or at least we know that's a criteria of a true experiment. However, in a quasi experiment, the IV is generally not manipulated by the researcher because instead of being what we call a manipulated independent variable, it is what is known as a participant or assigned variable. So, a participant variable, as your book calls it, or as a lot of other books call it, an assigned variable, uh, what those are extraneous variables that are related to individual characteristics of each participant that may impact how he or she responds. So we can't manipulate if someone has done drugs or not for obviously ethical reasons. We can't manipulate if someone is adopted or raised by their biological parents. There's certain variables that are within a participant because of their unique background and unique history. And so we're not able to manipulate those things, in which case we kind of forego the opportunity to have a true experiment, but we're still able to kind of use participant variables in quasi-experiments. So examples of other participant or assigned variables are variables like mood, anxiety, intelligence, awareness, and just any characteristic that is specific to one individual. And then there are also limitations with being able to use manipulated IVs because of organismic variables. So, organismic variables are variables that are specific to an organism. So, in the way that birds all, when they fly or when they migrate, they fly in the shape of a V, or in the way that bears hibernate, or in a certain organism's skin color or their sex, or we might categorize organismic variables by weight or height or age, but it has to do with kind of more focused on a categorical, larger group, an organism, a species, and so it's not necessarily unique to one individual, but more so considered to be a physiological or psychological factor that is kind of operating under the skin. Another limitation of our hypothesis could arise if the participants are not able to be randomized into groups. So, in other words, if we can't randomly assign half of our participants to a control group and half of our participants to a treatment group because it would be unethical or it's just not practical or whatever the reason may be. So, for an example of this type of scenario, imagine that you are a researcher and you want to know if rehab is effective in treating a crack cocaine addiction. So it would obviously be unethical to take people that are addicted to the substance and then randomly assign them to rehab or not, because that assignment of rehab might make a difference in whether those people live or die. So we wouldn't be able to do that ethically. Alternatively, we could take people that are addicted to crack cocaine but went and sought rehab on their own, so they're currently in rehab. And then we could find people that are addicted to the substance but not getting rehab and do a comparison of those two groups. We obviously would be foregoing a true experiment in doing that because of the lack of random assignment, but we would still be able to do a quasi-experiment. Another limitation to true experiments is that there must be a control group. If there's not a control group, then you actually would have a quasi-experiment. So some research questions don't lend themselves to a control group because they're interested in researching dichotomous relationships. For example, if you wanted to compare introverts versus extroverts, there may not be a control group in that scenario, a person who is neither of those things. So you would have to just do a quasi-experiment using those two groups, introvert and extrovert, and do the comparison there and just not have a control group at all. Let me give you an example of a quasi-experiment. So let's pretend the research question is, what are the effects of living in a single or two-parent home on children's preference for television programming? So if they have one parent with them, do they watch more funny shows than if they live with two parents? Or how does it affect their television watching? So the design of this quasi-experiment is, number one, find children in two groups, children from a single-parent home and children from a two-parent home. The second step would be to show each group TV programs. And the third step would be to measure the correlation between how they respond and the number of parents in their home. So if this was a true experiment, what would you have to do differently? In order to test this research question using a true experiment, you would have to randomly assign children at birth to single or two-parent homes in order to control for all the other extraneous variables. However, this would not be practical or ethical, and therefore we're left with having people be assigned naturally to these homes based on just what they're born into, and therefore we have to do a quasi-experiment. Another type of quasi-experiment is called a time series design, and this is where participants are going to be exposed to a treatment, and so you measure them before the treatment and then you measure them again after the treatment. What makes this quasi instead of a true experiment is that the researcher doesn't control the IV whatsoever. So the researcher isn't giving out the treatment, the researcher isn't giving out the manipulation, and they're also not in charge of the timing in which the treatment is delivered. And so, although we could refer to the event that we are interested in studying as a treatment, it actually isn't a treatment because we are not doing anything to the people. We are not treating them in any way. Instead, the treatment is really an event that's happening to them, and we just kind of happen to be there at the right time and place. So, for example, let's say that you're interested in studying high blood sugar. And so you reach out to a doctor or several doctors and you get a list of patients that have high blood sugar. And the doctor lets you know that these people are going to be given or started on a medication very soon, and the results are going to be monitored. And so you decide that you're going to do a time series design on these people since the treatment is going to happen to them anyways, but it hasn't happened yet. And so you would be able to measure their blood pressure before they start taking this medication, and then measure their blood pressure again after taking their medication. And this way you didn't violate any ethical rules of giving some people that needed medication the medicine and other people not, just for the purpose of having a control group. But instead, this was the natural course of their life. They were going to be given this medication either way. And so you are just there before they get the medication and after to record the data. Another type of time series design that can occur kind of unexpectedly is known as an interrupted time series design. So, similar to the time series design we talked about just now, this one is not within our control either. So, the treatment is not introduced by the researcher, but instead is happening naturally. So, what happens with an interrupted time series design is that the researcher is studying some phenomenon, maybe relationships or divorce or something like that, and then unexpectedly an event happens, like 9/11 or the coronavirus pandemic, or something huge happens that interrupts the study and changes the direction of kind of the way that your participants were leading their lives, and now this new phenomenon is occurring and is worthy of studying or worthy of treating as an independent variable on the behavior you were already studying. So, if you were studying, like I said, divorce or relationships, and then the pandemic happens, and now you want to kind of study the effects of this pandemic on the relationship, that would constitute an interrupted time series design and is a quasi experiment because, again, in that situation, we don't have a control group, so we don't know if the change in the behavior of our participants, in the quality of the relationship, or how they're treating one another is because of the pandemic or because of something else. Without that control group, we just can't know that. Then we have the multiple time series design, which essentially just adds another group to your study. In this case, it would be a control group that hasn't had the treatment happen to them or isn't going to have the treatment happen to them. So it can be interrupted or it can be normal time series design. But either way, having that extra control group can provide some much needed information about what might have happened to these people had the treatment not occurred. So, for example, with our blood sugar patients, you could take people that have the high blood sugar and are going to be getting the treatment and study them before and after the treatment. And then you can introduce another control group where perhaps another doctor that also has the same number of patients with high blood pressure but is not going to give them a treatment could be tested. So you could compare that way. However, it would not be a true experiment but a quasi experiment because those groups are occurring naturally and the people are not being randomly assigned to either the doctor that's giving out the medication or the doctor that's not giving out the medication. So, having that control group lends some validity to your experiment. It doesn't make it a true experiment, but it does lend some validity, and that it helps us to understand the relationship between your IV and your DV. So, for example, if the people that are getting the medication do have a decrease in their blood pressure, and the people that are not getting the medication don't have a decrease in their blood pressure, then it's probably true that there is some effect of the medication on the blood pressure, but we wouldn't be able to say for sure with this type of design because there could be other factors or other variables that we're not accounting for. So we know in order for a study to be a true experiment, there must be a control group, a treatment group, and then random assignment to either of those groups. But sometimes that's just not possible because you don't have enough people, or because the nature of your research question creates practical or ethical limitations. And so, if you run into those obstacles, then you are able to do a non experimental design using non equivalent groups. And so, a non equivalent groups design is structured like a pre test post test, which is again just like a repeated measures or before and after design, meaning that you measure the DV before and after the introduction of the IV. So, you pre test before the IV is delivered, and then you post-test the DV after the IV is delivered. So again, a non-equivalent groups design is structured like a pre-test, post-test, but it actually lacks random assignment. So generally with a non-equivalent groups design, we have to use intact groups or naturally occurring groups that we think are similar as the treatment and control groups. So remember, the purpose of equivalent group designs is that we're randomly assigning participants to either a control group or an experimental group. And in doing so, hopefully we'll get a representative sample of our population, because randomizing everyone should give us kind of similar people in each group. So if we end up with, um, 50 females in one group, through random assignment, generally we would end up with 50 females in the other group or close to. So when we don't do random assignment, we can't be sure that we're representing all facets of our population or that our sample is representative at all. However, we can try to get the groups to be similar. Maybe we do that by comparing, let's say, like my morning research methods class with my evening research methods class. And so we think those groups are similar, but maybe there's something fundamentally different about those the people in those two groups that we're kind of not considering. Like, for example, maybe the people that are in my morning class have a different set of characteristics that gets them up in the morning and going, and the people that are in my evening class have their own set of characteristics that kind of got them into wanting to take classes at night. Maybe it's work, a full schedule, whatever. But nonetheless, maybe these groups actually have something in common with one another, and instead of being representative of the entire population of San Bernardino Valley College and all of the students that go there, people that take morning classes and evening classes, people that work, people that don't work, each group is actually kind of biased in its sample, in that it's selecting people that take classes in the morning or people that take classes in the evening. And so this is problematic because we don't then know if the reasons that the people are taking the morning or evening classes are extraneous variables that would affect whatever the DV is we're studying. So let's say for the purposes of this example, my morning class is going to be trying something new, and we know this in advance. So we're going to give them an exam, and then that exam is going to be taken in person, face-to-face, and then they're going to be transitioned to online halfway through the semester. And so they'll complete the remainder of their coursework online. And so we'll compare the exam scores that they received from taking the class online with the exam scores that they received when they took it in person. And so this is not going to be able to be a true experiment because it doesn't have a control group. So let's say that we add the control group of the evening. Well, it's still not going to be a true experiment even though we have added the control group of the evening class, again, because we don't have that random assignment. But we at least have this control group, which we could say that the control group is going to stay in class the entire time and never be transitioned to online. So we can compare all of their exam scores with the exam scores that occurred before and after that transition. So we've talked about longitudinal research before, and it actually does constitute non-experimental research, again, because it doesn't have like a clear treatment group and a clear control group. But as a reminder, longitudinal research is the type of research that studies a group over a long period of time to determine how characteristics measured early in life relate to their behavior later in life. So this type of research is commonly used by developmental psychologists. We've talked about this before. Lewis Terman and Terman's termites is one of the most popular examples of longitudinal studies, and this was the one where the researchers found children that had IQs over 140 and studied them their entire life in order to test the research hypothesis that people with high IQs are socially awkward. And of course, they found that that was not the case. So, the problem with this type of research, again, or the thing that makes it not a true experiment, is that it doesn't have clear groups. We just look for factors that may predict future behavior. So, developmental psychologists will look for how IQ will affect behavior, like in the Terman study, or how traumatic childhood events will affect your future. So, longitudinal research is difficult and expensive to conduct. One of the major problems of longitudinal research is attrition, which is the loss of participants. So, people drop out over time, and it can be unclear if the reason for that attrition is something to do with the research itself or other variables. And so, because of that, it can affect the internal validity of our study. If we don't know the reason that people are dropping out, there may be some factor that's going on that's influencing people's behavior up to and including them dropping out that we haven't even considered. So, one way to preserve the effect on internal validity is to compare data of those still in your study with those who dropped out. So, you can kind of look back at your past observation and see if there's anything fundamentally similar about those people that dropped out, and fundamentally similar about those people that stayed in. So, cross-sectional research is another type of non-experimental research. We've talked about it before, but just as a review, cross-sectional research is where we study different groups of people who differ in the variable of interest but share other characteristics, such as socioeconomic status, educational background, ethnicity. So, for example, instead of studying one group of people when they are 5 years old, and then again when they're 10, and then those same people again when they're 15, and then again when they're 20, like we do in longitudinal research, you can study 4 different groups of people on the same day that are those ages. And so this is usually used by developmental psychologists. One of the problems with this is what's known as the cohort effect. So when a group of the same age people share variables that are related to their history, it's called the cohort effect. So an example of that is that my dad, some people call him cheap. You could call him frugal. I don't know what we should call him, but he likes to reuse Ziploc bags, for example. And he was raised by his parents who grew up in the Great Depression, and they had to save and conserve all of their resources because there wasn't like disposable income or anything like that. And they kind of passed that down to my dad. And so, depending on what it was that we were studying, that behavior of being frugal or conservative with resources could be something that would affect our DV. And so that would need to be considered when we're doing cross-sectional research, because if we're looking at age groups and everyone in the same age has similar experiences that are affecting their behavior, those similar experiences could become confounding variables if we don't account for them and control for them. Then we have sequential research, which employs both cross-sectional and longitudinal. So where longitudinal, you study one group of people over time. Cross-sectional is you study age groups at kind of the same time. So with longitudinal, you check in on people when they're 5, 10, 15, 20 years old. With cross-sectional, you just bring in a group of 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 20-year-olds to your lab, and you do it all on the same day. So sequential kind of employs both of those, where they might study those same 4 groups, a group of 5-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 20-year-olds, but instead of just doing it that day, like cross-sectional research, they will study those 4 groups over time, like as in longitudinal research. What's cool about sequential research is that it helps us understand changes in behavior over time, but what it doesn't do is provide us specific and comprehensive information about why or how those changes occur. So one of the things that we can use, one of the tools in our toolbox as researchers that we can use to help overcome this obstacle is what's known as microgenetic method. So the microgenetic method studies the process of change, but it provides information about why or how changes occur as well, which is in contrast to the sequential method. So this method suggests that we look at specific transitional periods in life when rapid change is occurring and collect both quantitative and qualitative data. So Piaget did some great research using the microgenetic method where he took children and he had them do a task testing them for conservation. And so he would ask participants to solve the problem, and then you could get a quantitative measurement of how many tasks they got correct or how many items on a test they got correct. But then Piaget would also ask people to explain the reasoning for why they gave the answers on the task that they gave. And so that is a way to get a more comprehensive understanding of a behavior by collecting both qualitative and quantitative data. So we've talked about case studies before, but now we're going to discuss them in the context of non-experimental research. As a reminder, a case study is when a researcher is interested in studying a single individual on many variables, but where no treatment is being assessed. So the researcher is not doing any type of manipulation to the single individual or getting involved in any type of way, but rather just kind of observing, taking notes, and collecting data on that person as they are without giving any treatment or doing anything to them. So the goal of the case study is a description of the individual that you're studying. It's not interested in some treatment or understanding a treatment or manipulation or an IV. And so a case study is really an in-depth study of a single individual. It's common in clinical psychologists where a therapist will have an interesting client for an extensive amount of time and maybe wants to report the case. Case studies are descriptive and qualitative because they describe the characteristics of one person, but they cannot be generalized to a population because they are just one person's unique experience. And so the point of the case study is to show what can happen, not what generally happens. Check out this famous case study done by Freud. It's called the Little Hans case study.
So today's video might seem a little bit strange, but most things concerning Freud have a certain strangeness about them, especially in today's time. This is the case study of Little Hans. The name Little Hans is a pseudonym for Herbert Graf, who was the son of a Viennese music critic named Max Graf. Max Graf was a family friend of Freud and a follower of his theories. Little Hans was born in 1903 in Vienna and unusually was not treated directly by Freud, but rather by his father, who would correspond with Freud through a series of letters detailing his son's behavior and quoting their conversations. Only on one occasion did Freud hold a session with the boy in person. Little Hans had been affected by a traumatic event which had occurred when he was 4 years old, in which he had witnessed an accident. A horse carrying a heavily loaded cart collapsed in the street. After the event, the boy's parents noticed that he had begun to develop a fear of horses, particularly those carrying a heavy load, or those with black around their eyes, or wearing blinkers. It was believed that the phobia was linked to the sight of the large genitalia of the animals, and the fear of horses led to Little Hans trying to avoid leaving his home in case he encountered one of the animals. In Graf's letter to Freud, he described a preoccupation with the male genitals, which led his wife to threaten his son with calling a doctor to castrate him if it did not end. Max Graf relayed to Freud numerous conversations with his son, which he felt might be of significance to the case. On one occasion, Little Hans described 2 giraffes entering the room that he was in. He imagined one of the giraffes began to crumple, and took it away from the second giraffe, who called out to him. Additionally, sibling jealousy became a problem for Little Hans. When he was 3.5 years old, his mother gave birth to a baby sister. The attention of his mother, that his newborn sister deprived him of, led him to feelings of jealousy towards her, and he indicated a wish that she would drown in the bath. Little Hans himself also developed a fear of such misfortune occurring to him. The birth of his sister led Little Hans to question the process of conception and childbirth. Unwilling to explain this to their son, his parents provided Hans with the traditional story of a stork delivering babies in boxes. By 1909, Freud's ideas about the Oedipus complex were well established, and Freud interpreted this case in line with his theory. As mentioned, Freud didn't actually work directly with Little Hans, but instead worked through correspondence with Hans's father. Again, Hans's father was familiar with Freud's theories and wrote to him when he first suspected that Hans had become a case that Freud might be interested in. Freud suggested possible lines of questioning which the father could try with Hans, and the father tried them and reported to Freud what had taken place. The first reports of Hans are when he was 3 years old, when he developed an active interest in his penis, which he called his whittler, and also the whittlers of other people. For example, on one occasion he asked, "Mummy, have you got a whittler too?" Throughout this time, the main theme of his fantasies and dreams were whittlers and whittling. When Hans was almost 5, Hans's father wrote to Freud explaining his concerns about Hans. Freud wrote a summary of his treatment of little Hans in 1909 in a paper entitled Analysis of a Phobia in a 5-year-old Boy. Since the family of little Hans lived opposite a busy coaching inn, that meant Hans wasn't happy about leaving the house because he saw many horses as soon as he went out the door. When he was first asked about his fear, Hans said that he was frightened that the horses would fall down and make a noise with their feet. He was most frightened of horses which were drawing heavily laden carts, and in fact, as mentioned, he had seen a horse collapse and die in the street one time when he was out with his nurse. This accident was a horse-drawn bus carrying many passengers, and when the horse collapsed, Hans had been frightened by the sound of its hooves clattering against the cobbles of the road. He had also suffered attacks of a more generalized anxiety. Hans's anxieties and phobias continued as he was afraid to go outside of the house because of his phobia of horses. When Hans was taken to see Freud, he was asked about the horses he had a phobia of. Hans noted that he didn't like horses with black bits around the mouth. Freud believed that the horse was a symbol for his father, and the black bits were a moustache. After the interview, the father recorded an exchange with Hans where the boy said, "Daddy, don't trot away from me." Over the next few weeks, Hans's phobia gradually began to improve. Hans said that he was especially afraid of white horses with a black around the mouth who were also wearing blinkers. Hans's father interpreted this as a reference to his moustache and spectacles. After many letters were exchanged, Freud concluded that the boy was afraid that his father would castrate him for desiring his mother, classical Oedipus complex. Freud interpreted that the horses in the phobia were symbolic of his father, and that Hans feared that the horse, i.e. his father, would bite, i.e. castrate him, as punishment for his incestuous desires towards his mother. The end of Hans's phobia of horses was accompanied by 2 significant fantasies which he told to his father. In the first, Hans had several imaginary children. When asked who their mother was, Hans replied, "Why, Mummy, of course," and, to his father, "You're their granddaddy." In the second fantasy, which occurred the next day, Hans imagined that a plumber had come first to remove his bottom and his whittler, and then gave him another one of each, but both were larger. Freud saw Hans's phobia as an expression of the Oedipus complex. Horses, particularly horses with black harnesses, symbolized his father. Horses were particularly suitable father symbols because of their large penises, according to Freud. The fear began as an Oedipal conflict was developing regarding Hans being allowed in his parents' bed. Hans told his father of a dream fantasy, which his father summarized as follows. In the night there was a big giraffe in the room and a crumpled one, and the big one called out because I took the crumpled one away from it. Then it stopped calling out, and I sat down on top of the crumpled one. Freud and his father interpreted the dream fantasy as being a reworking of the morning exchanges in the parental bed. Hans enjoyed getting into his parents' bed in the morning, but his father offered an objective, the big giraffe calling out because he had taken the crumpled giraffe mother away. Both Freud and his father believed the long neck of the giraffe was a symbol for the large adult penis. However, Hans himself rejected this idea. Freud saw the Oedipus complex resolved as Hans fantasized himself with a big penis like his father's, and married to his mother, with his father present in the role of grandfather. Hans did recover from his phobia after his father, at Freud's suggestion, assured him that he had no intention of cutting off his penis. Freud was attempting to demonstrate that little Hans's fear of horses was related to his Oedipus complex. Freud thought that, during the phallic stage, which occurs approximately between 3 and 6 years old, a boy develops an intense sexual love for his mother. Because of this, he sees his father as a rival and wants to get rid of him. The father, however, is far bigger and more powerful than the young boy, and so the child develops a fear, seeing him as a rival, that his father will castrate him. Because it is impossible to live with continual castration threat anxiety provided by this conflict, the young boy develops a mechanism for coping with it, using a defense mechanism known as identification with the aggressor. He stresses all the way that he is similar to his father, adopting his father's attitudes, mannerisms, and actions, feeling that if his father sees him as a similar, he will not feel hostile towards him. So there is some criticism with the interpretation of the case. For instance, the case study of little Hans does appear to provide support for Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex. However, there are difficulties with this type of evidence. Hans's father, who provided Freud with most of his data, was already familiar with the Oedipus complex and interpreted the case in light of this. It is therefore possible that he supplied Hans with clues that led to his fantasies of marriage to his mother and his new, large whittler. Of course, even if Hans did have a fully fledged Oedipus complex, this shows that the Oedipus complex exists, but not how common it is. Remember that Freud believed it to be universal. The problem with case studies is that they lack population validity. Because they are often based on one person, it is not possible to generalize the results to a wider population. At the age of 19, the not-so-little Hans appeared at Freud's consulting room having read his case history. Hans confirmed that he had suffered no troubles during adolescence and that he was fit and well. He could not remember the discussions with his father and described how when he read his case history, it came to him as something unknown. So that is the case of little Hans and Freud. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. If you are interested in more videos like this, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.
So everyone has heard the saying correlation is not causation, and that is really the defining reason that correlational research is non-experimental rather than a true experiment where you are able to infer causation because you have that control of the variables and you have that control group and you have random assignment. But with correlational research, we're not looking to compare the difference between two groups. What we're looking to do is to see if there is a relationship between one variable and another variable. So when X happens, what does Y do? And it's not that X is causing this change in Y, it's just that they happen to be moving this way in this space and time. So as one variable increases, another variable could also be increasing just out of sheer coincidence, or that variable could be increasing because of whatever is happening with variable X. But we just can't determine any type of causal relationship for sure with a correlational study because there's so many other factors that we're not considering. We're just looking at the two variables in question. For example, while there would be a correlation between ice cream sales and murder rates, it would not be appropriate to conclude that ice cream causes murder. In fact, there's probably another variable that isn't even being considered in this correlational design, which probably would be hot weather. So hot weather could be the thing that's increasing ice cream sales and also increasing murder rates, but the two variables of ice cream and murder actually have nothing to do with one another. And then finally, we have regression. So regression also looks at the relationship between variables similar to correlational research. But what it does is it looks to predict relationships. So in a linear regression, we look at the relationship between one predictor variable, which you could think of as the IV, and a single criterion variable, which you could think of as the DV. So you might ask someone, how do you feel right now? And their response might be bad. Bad would represent the criterion variable or the data for that variable. And then you might ask them, what is the cause for why you feel that way? And their response might be that they're hungry. And so hunger would be a predictor variable. And we could use that information to predict that the next time they're hungry, they're going to feel bad again. There's also a multiple regression, which is also interested in making predictions. And so with multiple regressions, instead of looking at the relationship between a singular criterion variable and a predictor variable, it looks at the relationship between a criterion variable and a number of predictor variables. And so the multiple regression analysis is able to tell us if a predictor variable is positively or negatively correlated with the criterion variable. And it's also able to tell us the importance of each predictor variable in determining behavior by the correlation coefficients that it gives us. So we know higher correlation coefficients represent a stronger relationship, and in this case, a stronger prediction of the effect on the criterion variable. And that is the end of chapter 10. We'll talk to you next time.